Honestly, to tell you the truth, reading through this and taking it into the New Testament just makes me feel dumber. So the more time we spend actually putting these psalms in their context and explaining what they mean, I think the better the program will be.
I think it's interesting. I think that the worst thing a church could ever do would be to disciple people and actually take them through all these passages.
I've never, in the 40 years that I was in the church, never was it offered to me to do a Bible study on the 300 plus prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, and I can totally understand why.
Yeah, it would be pretty scary.
It would be thoroughly detrimental to their faith to do this Bible study.
Isn't that interesting? Because it's touted, almost like it's like a throwaway line. It's like a it's almost like a cliche. It's a cliche that we have all these hundreds of prophecies, which I guess at surface value sounds very impressive. It's almost intimidating. Wow, there are so many proofs. But the irony, I guess, is that if anyone were to really sit down and try and digest this, that they would, run in the opposite direction. It's so fascinating.
Any reasonable person, you would hope, would do that. And as you said last week, it's clearly a bluff, and it's not. I mean, that's not to insult the faith or anything like that. But it's if anything, it's to add some theological intellect to the faith to say that it is a bluff. It just cannot be taken seriously. They don't expect people to study through it.
Well, I think I've told you that when I've spoken to people, like sort of man to man, like sort of having a real conversation, I ask them honestly, how many prophecies do you really think there are, in the Hebrew Scriptures? And most people I've spoken to will say, 10, 15, like maybe 20.
Yeah.
They don't really...
Maybe 20, yeah.
Yeah, they don't really honestly think it's more than that.
G'day wherever you may be around the world, and thank you for your company on truth2u.org. That's truth, number 2, letter U.org. Joining me this hour, one of the world's most foremost authorities on missionaries, cults, and the Jewish community. He is the Director of Education and Counseling for Jews for Judaism Canada, and the website is jewsforjudaism.ca. Jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
So, it's great to be here again, Jono. It's evening here. I guess it's afternoon with you.
Afternoon in the winter here, and it's evening in the summer there in Canada where you are. We're plodding through. I mean, we're making some progress, right? We've made a dent in it so far, investigating the supposed 365 Messianic prophecies of Jesus in the Tanakh. Where are we up to? We're up to the Psalms, the book of Psalms, and the number 59. So we're certainly making progress. And this one kicks off in chapter 2. Now, before we jump into the Psalms, my friend, let me ask you a question, if I may. In Judaism, is the book of Psalms considered a book of prophecy?
Not technically. The Bible is divided into basically 3 sections. It's even these 3 sections are alluded to in the Christian scriptures, but there's what's called the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then there are the books of the prophets, and then there are what is referred to as the writings. And the way it's understood, at least in terms of Jewish theology, is that these are different levels of divine inspiration. They speak about the 5 books of Moses. The prophecy of Moses is considered to be of a different nature than all other prophets. Moses was fully awake when God spoke with him. Other prophets were in a dream state. They saw visions. They speak about Moses receiving the revelation from God, baklaria ha'me'ira, with a clear interface. There was no static when God communicated with him. And that's why law, our commandments, the way that we're supposed to live, only is found in the 5 books of Moses. None of the other writings gave revelation in terms of law. All the other prophets were basically there to encourage us to live according to the laws revealed by Moses. So the 5 books of Moses is a separate unit because it's a degree of prophecy that was unlike any of the other prophets.
It's the foundation of the faith, right?
The
5 books of Moses is the foundation of the faith. Now, I'm looking at Luke chapter 24, verse 44, and it says, these are the words of Jesus. It says, "Then he said to them, these are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled," which we're dealing with now, "which were written in the law of Moses and in the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." So here we are in the Psalms. Clearly he understood the Psalms and the prophets to be two different things, and yet this list is absolutely full of what Christians believe to be, or many Christians believe to be, messianic prophecies of Jesus that he fulfilled.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how the word prophecy is understood. You know, often people associate the idea of prophecy with foretelling the future. And that's really the most common understanding of the word prophecy, that when we hear about someone uttering prophecy, we think that they're telling us something that's going to happen in the future. That's not really accurate. The second time the word prophet appears in the Bible, I think it's the second time, is when God says to Moses that Aaron, your brother, will be your prophet. Moses was complaining that he really shouldn't be the person to go to speak with Pharaoh. He has a speech impediment. And God says to him, look, you'll take Aaron, your brother, and he will be your prophet. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that Aaron is going to be the person to foretell the future. It means that he will be your spokesperson. Uh-huh. And the word prophecy then really simply means that someone is speaking on behalf of God. And it wasn't always to predict the future. The reason I think that people make that association is because a large part, or probably the majority of what prophets came to do, was to reprove the people, to tell them that they were behaving improperly, they were not living up to their potential, they were violating the covenant, and there would often be an explicit or implicit threat. The prophet would say, and if you don't get your act together, then you're really going to get it. And so there was often a prediction that accompanied the reproof, you know, the getting beaten up by the prophet. So there is this assumption that, you know, the prophecy was basically to predict the future. But technically speaking, we see this in the passage you just quoted from the Gospel of Luke, that these are different levels of divine revelation, and that the prophets, the people who were prophets, technically speaking prophets, had a degree of prophecy that was considered, that means a degree of communication and reception of communication from God that was even clearer and more direct than the writings, which would include the book of Proverbs and Psalms, and the scrolls, Ecclesiastes and Lamentations. And the rabbis say these are revealed with not so much with prophetic transmission, but with what's called Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. And it was considered to be a degree of revelation that was even a little bit less direct and less clear. Now, does it mean that these writings did not contain statements about the future, if that's what we mean when we say contain prophecy? So they sometimes did. The Psalms did sometimes speak about the future. So if you want to use the word prophecy in the colloquial sense as implying statements about what would be happening in the future, then yeah, these books like Psalms do contain passages like that. But strictly speaking, these are not books of prophecy. That's why there's a third section to the Bible. That's why we classify them, and even the Gospels classify them in a different category than the books of the prophets.
Fair enough. No, thank you for that explanation. And at the moment, we find ourselves, according to this list, we find ourselves in Psalm chapter 2. In fact, on the list of 365 prophecies, this is number 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, all the way to 65 is derived from Psalm, pretty much works its way all the way through. It might be an idea to begin by putting Psalm chapter 2 in its context. And shall I read the whole thing, or would you like to just give us an overview?
Why don't you read it? We'll hear some scripture on your show.
Let's do that. I'd like to do that. It goes like this. Now, I'm going to read purposefully, of course, from the New King James, the Christian translation. Feel free to interject. It says, "Why do the nations rage And the people plot a vain thing. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord, against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. He shall speak to them in his wrath and distress them in his deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree, the Lord has said to me. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now, therefore, be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way when his wrath is kindled but a little. Blessed are all those who put their trust in him. There it is, Psalm chapter 2.
Just as David wrote it.
Just as David wrote it in King James English, there it is.
New King James English.
That's right.
The truth is that it's not a terrible translation. We'll see there's one, real sort of problem with the translation. Even there, it's not worth going to war over. But, the context here is fairly straightforward. It's speaking about, this coming together of the nations and kings conspiring against and really opposing God and God's anointed one. And the psalm basically speaks about how their plans and their plotting will just really come to nothing, and that God will ultimately, vanquish them, and they're not going to succeed in whatever they're trying to do. And really, it's a statement of, who really runs the world, and all the plotting of these human leaders will come to nothing. And the psalm really ends, as many psalms do, with encouragement to really live properly, to follow God, and to follow God properly. And that's really what's going on here. And obviously, this list of prophecies we're going through sees in this, one psalm, incredibly, half a dozen prophecies that they claim prove that Jesus was the Messiah. So
those particular prophecies, it includes things like, in this particular list, it says the enmity of kings foreordained, that he would own the title Anointed, his character would be holiness, he would own the title King, he would declare to be the beloved Son. In there also apparently is the crucifixion and the resurrection intimated. Life comes through faith in Jesus. So these are what's on the list, and they've given some references in the New Testament to support that.
Yeah, I might mention actually one or two of them, because they become interesting in some of the cases.
Okay, we can do that. Let me, just in the beginning of Psalm chapter 2, let me clarify some things, if I may. It says, and rulers shall take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Now, I've got, of course, in the New King James version, it's a very Christological slanted translation, and one of the ways that it enforces that is, of course, is capitalizing certain words, and in this case, anointed is capitalized, and what they mean to say in just that one capital A is that this is in reference to Jesus. Now, in actual fact, this is in reference to the King of Israel, and are we talking about, because it goes on to say in verse 6, yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. It then goes on to say, the Lord has said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Of course, that takes us back to what we were talking about last week in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. Which king are we talking about? We're talking about a king. Are we talking about David or Solomon?
Well, that's a great question. Jewish commentaries have a great time trying to figure out who this is talking about, and there are basically two or three candidates that really come to the fore. The truth is, some of the commentaries say that this might be a reference to the ultimate king, which is the Messiah, that final great king. And so really, in the list of 59 that we've done so far, this might actually be the fourth actual passage that really does speak about the future Messiah. It's not clear, though, and some commentaries say that it's speaking, though, about David or even about his son Solomon. So usually those are the three candidates that come up here, and they all make a lot of sense. That these are all kings. The Messiah will be a king. David and Solomon were kings. David and Solomon were both referred to as God's son, basically being referred to as God's son in the same way in Exodus 4:22, the Jewish people in general are referred to as God's son. Is simply a way that the Bible speaks about some closeness, a close relationship with God. So, it's not really clear exactly which anointed one this is referring to. I'm surprised that the King James and other Christian translations don't just simply say, call this person God, the Messiah. Meaning, why mince words? Because anointed one is sort of vague. There are so many anointed ones in the Bible.
Well, this is true, and you know what? Jason and I, Jason from spiritualbabies.net, we did a program on this, and I think it was called Messiah in the Tanakh, and we went through all the places where Mashiach is mentioned. And the word anointed as well. And here you have a capital A anointed. In fact, you have capital A anointed all through the New King James. The only place where it is translated as Messiah is, of course, Daniel chapter 9. And as I pointed out on the program, isn't that an opportunity missed? Because this is the word that they could have enforced even more so by putting the word Messiah there. Why do you think they didn't?
I have no idea. I mean, I think that would have been, for a Christian to write the word Messiah here would have been legitimate. It's certainly what the word says in Hebrew. I think that what we should point out, though, and I think this is significant here in this psalm, is that it's very clear that the text here differentiates between God and the Messiah. It doesn't say that these kings will come up against God the Messiah. It's against God and God's Messiah. So it's very clear that the Messiah here is not God. If we want to go with that approach that sees this anointed one as the future Messiah. Again, it could easily be referring to another king, another anointed one like David or Solomon. But if we go with the interpretation that sees this psalm as really speaking about the future, the ultimate future king, the Messiah himself, it's just important to point out, like we see in the book of Hosea as well, chapter 3, that God is distinguished from the Davidic Messiah. It's not the same being. God is God, and the Davidic Messiah is another entity, and they are distinguished in the passage itself. Also, what's very interesting in this chapter is that it describes this king very clearly as one that will rule over Zion with a rod of iron, and that he will crush his enemies. So whoever it's speaking about, whether it's these descriptions did, certainly apply to David and Solomon. They ruled with a real rulership, and they did crush their enemies, and it will certainly be true of the future Messiah. The Bible is full of passages which speak about the ultimate vanquishing of the enemies of Israel by the Messiah in the Messianic age. But clearly, Jesus did not do any of this. And so, one person who it's clear this is not speaking about is Jesus. And as I mentioned last week, I think that this is, again, one of those Messianic prophecies that Christians will be forced to say, well, he will do this when he returns at the second coming. And that's really what we will see every time there is a passage in the scriptures that really could apply to the Messiah, a true Messianic prophecy. Christians will be forced to relegate it to the second coming, because clearly, when Jesus was living, he certainly did not crush his enemies. They crushed him. And he did not rule over Zion. He wasn't a king. He was never a king. He never ruled. So they're forced to say, well, he will rule. He will vanquish his enemies when he returns, which is fine. I mean, if people want to believe that, that's fine. But you can't point to this psalm and say it was something that Jesus fulfilled already, and that therefore it proves he's the Messiah. Just wanted to point out that, because I looked at these references in the Christian scriptures, Acts chapter 4 here speaks about the opponents of Jesus being Herod and Pilate.
Now, before you get there, an interesting, just a little thing. They've referenced Acts chapter 4, verses 25 to 28. The interesting thing about this is that verse 25 attributes this psalm to David, but in actual fact, the psalm isn't owned by anyone. Is that correct?
Well, it's interesting. Many of the psalms begin with a introduction saying that it's a psalm of David. Here, there isn't. Here, it just begins going into the content without an introduction, saying it's by David. But there's a sort of a default understanding that, by and large, the psalms are written by David. So again, the text doesn't...
So it's a fair assumption. It was probably traditionally understood as such in the first century, and it is too today in Orthodox Judaism.
I would imagine that would be the sort of normative guess.
Sure.
Yeah. It's not really... It's true that we don't really have, each one of the 150 psalms at the end of each one signed "Love David."
No.
So some of them do make it more explicit, and some of them,
sure, and some of them don't. And it goes on to say in 25 and 26, it quotes from Psalm chapter 2, and in verse 27 of Acts chapter 4, you were saying.
So what's interesting is that the psalm actually describes the kings of the earth conspiring against this anointed one of God. Now, he mentions the two kings that are mentioned in Acts are Herod and Pilate. Now, what I found interesting was that, the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew describes this story where Herod supposedly is terrified about the birth of Jesus, and he sends a small delegation to kill him. He wanted to nip this potential competitor, nip it in the bud and kill this child before he grows up to become, a competitor that would challenge his kingdom. But, the entire story of Herod sending this little army to kill all the babies in Bethlehem and the surrounding cities, it's mentioned in Matthew, but it's not mentioned anywhere else in the Christian Bible, and there's no historical sources that corroborate it. It would be the kind of story that if it happened, if there was such a massacre...
Oh, it's front page news. It's absolutely front page news.
It would have been
expected.
It would have been a big story. It would have been a serious story, but no other gospel mentions it. It's not in the Talmud. It's not in Josephus. It's not in Philo. It's not in Tacitus. No one on the planet mentions it but in Matthew, and it's the kind of story where we would assume that people would know about it. It would have been an incredible tragedy to have every baby that was under the age of 2, boy baby, not just in Bethlehem, but in all the surrounding cities, we're told, killed in this brutal massacre. So, it's not really clear that Jesus was really opposed by Herod. And then Pilate, I wouldn't name him as an incredible persecutor of Jesus, because the Christian scriptures go out of their way to say that Pilate really didn't see a problem with Jesus, and he didn't really seem to have it in Jesus. He seems to
it paints him in a light that is not that doesn't seem to concur with other historical accounts of Pilate. He was rather a bloodthirsty man, and wouldn't hesitate to slice open a Jew.
Yeah, but the Gospels portray him as very, very conciliatory and almost disregarding Jesus as a problem, meaning that he doesn't seem to be taking Jesus as a serious threat that he needs to squash.
Indeed, wanting to spare his life. Look, just take him and flog him a bit, and hopefully that'll placate the people, and we'll let him go.
Yeah, it seems that he's only caving into the these brutal Jewish crowds that are intimidating him. Now that we know is absurd, because Pilate was not intimidated by the Jews. He actually was a brutal, horribly brutal procurator. But the point is that Psalms is describing this opposition and this plotting against God's anointed one by the kings, and the two kings that are mentioned in the book of Acts don't really seem to be good candidates for the description in Psalms 2. I found that odd.
While we're in Acts, the next one that they reference is Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Therefore let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ.
Yeah, this is number 60, right? It's saying that this one I found to be very, very strange because, they say here on this list that this is a prophecy that the Messiah will have the title of Christ, which is so strange because Christ means Messiah. It's almost a tautology. Yeah. It's almost saying what this compiler of the list is saying is that there's this amazing thing we learned from the book of Psalms. And what is that? The amazing thing is that the Messiah will be called the Messiah. That can only happen, when we see what really is common in the Christian world. I can't tell you how many Christians have asked me, in all seriousness, why don't the Jews believe that Christ was the Messiah? And I tell them that, well, Christ means Messiah. It doesn't make much sense to say, why don't you believe the Messiah is the Messiah? Christ really became almost like a last name for Jesus, like Jesus Christ, Jesus Goldberg, Jesus Schwartz, Jesus Feldman. And there's very little understanding that, Messiah is not really someone's last name. It's simply a description of the person as having been anointed to serve in some capacity, either as a king or a high priest or something like that.
And as you just said, either as a king. So number 62, of course, says that he will own the title king. But of course, all kings were messiahs, were anointed, were Christs. They're all messiahs. That applies there as well.
Yeah, it's almost flabbergasting to see this list put together, really with very little.
It's relying on the ignorance of the reader.
Well, and the compiler. I think the compiler, in all innocence, just sort of, is taken by the fact that in Psalm 2, they speak about God's anointed one. And again, it's important to remember that all that's taking place in Psalm 2 is that it speaks about God's anointed, whether it's speaking about a particular king, historical king like David or Solomon, or it's even referring to the future Messiah himself, the anointed Messiah. But let's go with the interpretation, I'm willing to do that this psalm is referring to the future Messiah. So that's wonderful. It's talking about the fact that God is going to have opposition in the world, and so will God's anointed one. But there's nothing in this psalm that tells us that it's referring to Jesus, meaning it's again based upon circular reasoning. It's based upon the assumption of the compiler here that they begin with the premise that Jesus was the Messiah. So if Jesus was the Messiah, then any passage in the Bible that mentions the Messiah must then therefore be speaking about Jesus. But the entire thing only works in sort of backwards. As
has often been the case as we work through this list.
Yeah.
Okay, number 61, Psalm 2, verse 6, his character-holiness, and that apparently is reflected in John chapter 8, verse 46, and Revelations 3, 7. What that says in John, of course, is, which of you convicts me of sin, and if I tell you the truth, why do you not believe me? In Revelation 3, 7, it says, and to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, these things says he who is holy, there we go, he's holy, he who is true, he who has the key of David, he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts and no one opens.
So I was also really interested in this passage because it's clear that when you read Psalm 2 here, it's speaking about God. And we know throughout the entire Bible that we can speak about God's character as being holy. It says in Leviticus 18 that we're told to be like God. God says, Kadoshim Tihu, you shall be holy, Ki Kadosh Ani, as I, God, am holy. But what's interesting is that this psalm doesn't really speak about God's holiness. The psalm speaks about the Temple Mount as a holy place. It doesn't speak anything about the character of God here.
That's
as being
very
holy.
true. It's not even about the Mashiach, not about God. It says, I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion.
Yeah, there's something in this chapter about God being holy, although that's true about God. So how they got this in terms of this psalm is strange. And, what I would say is that, Jesus may have been a good person, but I don't see much evidence to compel us to think that he was what we call in Hebrew a kadosh. That's actually a very, very high level to reach. And what I found interesting is that the two proofs here that the character of Jesus was holy was in John 8:46, where he's chiding people who don't simply accept him for who he claimed to be, and doesn't seem to have any. Doesn't seem
Well, this one here, John 8:46 is saying is asserting that Jesus is sinless, but holiness doesn't necessarily mean sinless. I mean, if we're talking without sin, without blame, we're talking about someone who is righteous, but holiness means to be set apart, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could equate the two. You could say that generally speaking, someone that's sinless would be a holy person, if you want to use this, term holiness in that way. But I mean, there are different words, and it's just that I found these two references in the Christian scriptures sort of strange because they don't really prove that Jesus was sinless or holy. It's just the fact that he's asserting, that he's holy, or he's asserting that he's, I think in Revelations he refers to himself as holy, but in John he's basically only saying that he's someone who speaks the truth. There's not even a reference there that he's holy. So it's just, again, I don't want to demean the character of Jesus. I actually, could very well see him as being a person who strove for holiness. I just don't see any reason to assume just, without some kind of clear indication that he was indeed this kind of special person. In Hebrew, again, when we call someone a kadosh, a holy person, it's not the kind of character description that we would use for anyone, even good people. It's really a special class all by itself. And, again, unless we just simply work with the Christian scriptures as accepting what's being declared without questioning it, I would just, as a person trying to be objective, just wonder what is there to lead us to assume that he was indeed a holy person. All we get here really are his claims. And one thing we know from Jewish literature in general is that when someone goes around claiming to be holy, that's not usually the first candidate we'd see for a holy person. The one that, for example, that is saying how I'm such a humble person. A humble person doesn't walk around saying they're humble. It's almost the opposite. To the top rabbis say that, if you chase after honor, it runs away from you. And so to just assert these things about yourself, it doesn't really come off, to me at least, as strong evidence.
That reminds me of Fiddler on the Roof. Oh, I love that movie. And it's now, what's her name? I forget the second daughter's name when she said to Perchik, the rabbi who praises himself has a congregation of one. That's great. So to own the title king, now we talked about that, of course, all kings, all Mashiachs were either a king or a high priest, in some cases even a prophet, but that's no surprise.
Well, what's important, again, this is a very serious point, though, is that the passage in Psalms here speaks about this person as a king, specifically. Again, not every anointed one was a king. Some of the times they were priests, but here it specifically tells us that this anointed one will be anointed as a king. And it's important just to, again, be clear that Jesus was never anointed as a king.
No,
usually right. The anointing, by the way, was, it wasn't done in some barber shop. You were anointed by a prophet of God. And so there's no record that Jesus was anointed by a prophet of God. And it's also important that he never ruled as a Jewish king, meaning that unless you just take the word king and it becomes meaningless. The king was a specific office that had to rule in a political way. I mean, we know that what a king was we know, for example, when we say president of the United States, prime minister of a country, we understand exactly what that means. And, for someone, I think there's a passage where Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." So to basically redefine kingship in some spiritual way where it can't really be seen, it's not really a king in the sense that the Bible, especially here, uses the word king. Here it's really speaking about a political king that has rulership and that exercises rulership. As we said before, this is a king that's going to smash his enemies with a rod of iron. He's going to. I mean, it's speaking about someone who really functions in a very physical and political way as a king, as a ruler. And again, this simply does not apply to Jesus. Also, by the way, I don't remember, I might be wrong here, I don't remember any of Jesus' disciples referring to him as a king, speaking about him as a king. And the only person I think that really does refer to Jesus as a king is Pilate, who...
Are you the king of the Jews?
Yeah, and then he sort of sarcastically writes on the crucifixion stake, that's, here's the king of the Jews, almost saying mockingly, what kind of a king is this? But I don't think that his disciples ever really speak about him or refer to him as a king or as their king. I may be wrong there.
There's some homework. There's some homework for the listeners. If you know of a verse, please put it in the comments section. We would love to hear from you. Declared the beloved Son. Now, this is, of course, Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. You are my son, today I have begotten you. And that's why I said to you, is this in reference to David or is it in Solomon? Is it in reference to Solomon? And as you said, of course, both of those were referred to as God's son. And I think Solomon, the only person by name in the whole of the Tanakh to be referred to, the only individual by name to be referred to as God's son. And yet, as you also point out, it may well be a Messianic psalm, and it may be referring to the coming Messiah. But of course, that coming Messiah, as we established last week, must be a descendant of David and Solomon, the line through David and Solomon. The verse here is Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, and it says, "And suddenly a voice came out of heaven, saying, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased.'" Now, last time a voice came out of heaven, I don't know how often that happens, but that reminds me of the Sinai event where everybody almost passed out with fear and said, "Please, can you stop God from talking to us? Moses, we'll hear you. Let him talk to you, because if he keeps talking, we're going to die. We're so frightened."
Well, I guess this was a case that God was maybe speaking into his hand and quietly. But, again, what we're being asked here to do is we're being asked here to consider this passage in Psalms as, again, predictive and proving that Jesus was the Messiah. And the most we could extract from this psalm, is that the Messiah will be declared to be God's Son, and to have that closeness to God. But again, all it's really saying is that would be true of the Messiah. There's nothing in this psalm itself that points to Jesus specifically, meaning that the only way this would work and connect to Jesus is if we accept the New Testament's claims about Jesus. And then work backwards to Psalms. But it's impossible to go from Psalms to Jesus. There is no connection. There's nothing that we see in this psalm that would identify Jesus as this as this Messiah.
Now, it's also in Acts chapter 13, verses 29 to 33, which ends with that it says he was crucified, they took him down from the tree, they put him in the tomb, God raised him from the dead, lots of people saw it, and God has fulfilled this for us, their children, in that he has raised up Jesus, as it is also written in the second psalm, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." That's the writer of Acts puts that in there.
This is a serious clunker here, because in number 64, we're being told that these verses in Psalm intimate the crucifixion and the resurrection. Now, I looked pretty hard at this psalm, and there's nothing at all about a crucifixion or resurrection in this psalm, not even intimated. So it's hard for me to wrap my head around this, where the compiler of this list sees in Psalm 2 any indication that the Messiah one day would be crucified and resurrected. Typically what Christians say is that Jews fail to see Jesus as the Messiah because we're spiritually blind. Maybe that's why I can't see it in the psalm.
But it's specific. As I began with Luke chapter 24 at the beginning of this program, verse 46 says, "Then he said to them, thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day." Now, they're very specific things, that the Messiah, the Mashiach, must suffer and rise from the dead on the third day. Very, very specific things that he claims in the previous verses are in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. Now, it shouldn't be so hard. It shouldn't be that difficult to go through the 5 books of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, and find such a specific thing that the Messiah must suffer and die and rise on the third day. And I have to admit, I haven't been able to find it. Whenever I've taken that up with Christians, they've never been able to give me even one verse that would suggest such. The only thing that I always get, and maybe you experience this as well, is hints and shadows, which says to me that Jesus has not opened their eyes to the scriptures, as it says in those verses in the end of Luke.
But there's not even a hint or a shadow in the 5 books of Moses towards this idea. I mean, we didn't see anything, even in this list.
And this is specifically what he said, that the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms, all 3 categories apparently contain that information.
Well, here's the intimation in the Psalm, which is what this list says here, 64, the crucifixion and resurrection intimated. But I just simply don't see any intimation, or certainly nothing clear in this psalm about crucifixion or resurrection. So I think, there's an old saying that when you point your finger at people, you get 3 pointing back at yourself. So I've been called blind so many times. I wish I had $1 for every time I was told that I'm spiritually blind.
So if anybody knows of those particular verses, if you are a believer of the New Testament, please, I'm begging you, we would love to see that in the comments section. Not hints, not shadows, not suggestions, but those specific things identified in the law of Moses, in the prophets, and the Psalms. That would be grand. Number 65 is Psalm chapter 2, verse 12, and this list, 365 prophecies that Jesus fulfilled, suggests that life comes through faith in him, and citing John chapter 20, verse 31, which says, but these things are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
I always got a kick out of that verse in John, because it's sort of, it's an admission, really, that, these gospel stories were not written by journalists or historians. We're being told these are written specifically to promote faith in Jesus. That's why these stories are written. They had an agenda to get people to believe in Jesus. Now,
these things are written to talk you around.
Well, I mean, that wouldn't in and of itself prove that the stories are not accurate, but it's a bit of a tip-off, meaning that the writer here is telling us that there was a motivation for writing these stories. And again, he could be writing stories that are true, but we know that psychologically, if your goal is to convince people to believe in something, would you ever exaggerate stories or make up stories in order to get them to believe what you want them to believe? I've done a lot of research into, because one of the main themes of the gospel stories are the incredible miracles that Jesus allegedly performed. And I'm not around back then. I wasn't around 2,000 years ago, but we're living today where this formula is very, very commonly found, among Christian evangelists, that, they point to all the miracles that take place today in the church and in the lives of Christians, and that becomes, very important in terms of marketing Christianity, that, people's lives are changed and there are miracles that take place. And, I wonder to myself, Well, the gospel writers are claiming that miracles took place 2,000 years ago, and today's evangelists claim that miracles are taking place today. And I wonder, are all the stories that we're hearing today true? And if the people that are telling stories today might be fabricating stories, so then certainly would be possible that a writer 2,000 years ago, in order to convince people to believe in Jesus, would also fabricate or exaggerate stories. And what I found interesting is that a lot of my work, time was saved because Christians themselves have investigated many of these, claims to healings and to miracles. You don't need to have a skeptic like myself or someone that's not Christian doing this investigation. And in many of the investigations done by Christians themselves into these claims of healings and miracles, they themselves found, tremendous degree of fabrication and exaggeration. So I think that when John says here that he's writing, these stories in order to convince people to believe in Jesus, I think we should take him at his word and understand that this is the agenda that he's telling us that he has. And again, it wouldn't in and of itself impeach the credibility of the stories, but it would certainly give a person reason to be suspicious and to wonder.
That's very fair. Moving on from Psalm chapter 2, we now find ourselves number 66 of the list.
I have to roll you back there, John.
Oh, we've gone too far. Come on. Well, where are we?
This 65, claims that what this psalm is teaching us is that we are able to have life through faith in the Messiah. And this is not the way that the list compiler has this. It's not speaking about faith in, to him, obviously, him is both God and Jesus. They assume that they're one. But for the purposes of this compiler, he's saying that this is a list of prophecies about Jesus. And therefore, the claim is that this passage in Psalms teaches us that we can have life. I assume that means eternal life through faith in Jesus. And this is based upon a very, very controversial translation. The way most Christian Bibles, I think all Christian Bibles, translate Psalm 2, verse 12 is that we have to kiss the Son. And
I can't believe that I almost went past that. Here I am I'm looking at John, and I'm going, yeah, that's what John says, and okay, let's move on, But of course, you're absolutely right. So what I have, and I love the way that it appears here in my New King James Study Bible, it says, kiss the Son, lest he be angry. And it's got capitals all over the place, but it also has a couple of little asterisks, two in one line, indeed. And usually in my, the reason why I like to use the New King James Study Bible is for the most part when they're really kind of stretching the truth or being tricky with the text, they tell you, if they're lying to you, they kind of tell you with a little asterisk. And you have to go down, somewhere else on the page to find the smallest writing, the smallest font that you can find on the page. And that's where they tell you in a little bit more detail what it actually means. And what I'm reading here is phrases like embrace discipline or receive instruction. And what I have, in fact, from my new JPS in this verse, it says something entirely different. It says, pay homage in good faith, lest he be angered and your way be doomed in the mere flash of his anger.
Wow. So
why is it so different?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Hebrew here is both easy and hard. The Hebrew says nashku var, and the nashku part is easy. It literally means to kiss. So that's not controversial. And the problem is the second word, bar. What does it mean? Normally in the Hebrew scriptures, it refers to grain, most often. But there are, I think, 7 or 8 times when it speaks about purity and cleanliness. So it would be difficult to think about kissing grain unless you're some kind of a carb freak.
Well, now, hang on. I've got to pull the brakes on because we have in Judaism, of course, the age of 13 or whatever it may be, we have bar mitzvahs, right? What is this? What is it? It's a mitzvah for the grain? What are you talking about?
Well, so that's where this gets interesting because bar mitzvah is not a Hebrew expression. Bar mitzvah is Aramaic. And so what happens here is that the Hebrew, you would not translate this as kissing the grain. So the proper translation would be to kiss, literally kiss cleanliness or purity. And that's why the word kiss then is understood, not literally, but as a way of saying when you kiss something, you're really showing closeness to it and embracing it or homage to it. So the way it's normally understood is to embrace or to pay homage to really to be close with purity and cleanliness. It's a instruction for us to follow cleanliness and purity. The Christian translation that takes the word as son, it really is implying that the word here is not Hebrew but Aramaic. As you said, the bar mitzvah,
Well, now I have to. No, I've got to stop you again. Then what it should say. What you're suggesting is Christians interpret this as kiss the bar, as in kiss the son, lest he be angry at you, using the Aramaic bar, in the same way that in verse 7, you are my bar. Today I have begotten you. Is that right?
No, because in verse 7 it uses the Hebrew ben.
What do you mean? That's crazy. That makes no sense at all. So what you're saying is that earlier on in this chapter we have the Hebrew ben for son in verse 7, but all of a sudden down in verse 12 we borrow from the Aramaic?
Yeah, so you're asking a good question. Like, why would the psalmist here write the word son in Hebrew, which is the normal word ben, and then all of a sudden switch to the Aramaic term in verse 12? It's even a bigger problem than that, because if this was an Aramaic word, you'd have to ask the question, why would this word appear here in Psalm 2, verse 12 in Aramaic? There's no other time in the entire book of Psalms. It's a pretty big book. It's 150 chapters. Actually, it would be the longest book, I guess, in terms of chapters in the Bible.
And the word son appears many, many, many times. Tell me there's one other place where bar is used in reference to son.
No.
Surely, come on.
What? Well, not in the book of Psalms, and there's no other Aramaic in the book of Psalms. So it would be very, very strange.
Hang on, let me get this right. Wait. Let's just get this right. So what we have is the use of the word son in verse 7 of chapter 2, and it is the Hebrew ben, and that makes perfect sense. When we get to verse 12, it is the Aramaic bar, or at least that's what the Christian would say. This also means son. We're just borrowing from the Aramaic in order to make that work. But what you're saying is, I don't know how many times the word son is used in the Psalms, but it's a lot, and nowhere else is the Aramaic bar used in reference to son anywhere. In fact, what you're saying is Aramaic is not used.
Never.
Now we know that never in the Psalms. Now Aramaic is splashed through a little bit in Daniel. There's quite a bit in Daniel. There's some in Jeremiah.
There's a little teeny bit in Proverbs, I think, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
You have just once in a blue moon, but in Psalms it never comes up. So that would be a problem with verse 12. Another problem is that even if it was Aramaic, it wouldn't be the correct Aramaic word for the son. Meaning that the form of Aramaic to say the son would be vra. And bar really has the implication of just a son, not the son. So it really doesn't work smoothly, even in Aramaic.
Let me ask just one more question. If we, I think we've blown it away that obviously it doesn't mean son, but I can see why the Christian translations would want to do that. But if we go to verse 7, it says, "I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you." We find passages like that in regards to David. We find it certainly in regards to Solomon. Is there a commandment somewhere where Solomon or David said, "You must kiss me, otherwise I'm going to be angry"?
No, I think that I think that's what it means here as well. By the way, I think that if we do accept this translation, I could live with it. All it would be saying is, not kissing literally the Messiah, but submitting to the rule of the Messiah. There's nothing. See, again,
That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing.
well, we're required. We're required to listen to a king and to obey a king. And what the psalm clearly is not saying is that it implies that we're to worship this anointed one as God and worship him as God. You see, when it says in this list here, life comes through faith in him, the writer here is saying really believing in the Messiah, ultimately worshiping this anointed one. And, all it would mean if we accepted this, I think, a mistranslation, if it was to really be saying something about kissing the Son, would be that we have to have obedience and submit ourselves to the rule of this Messiah. Simply that. Nothing about believing in him, worshiping him as God. That much you would not be able to extract from the text.
No, so this is a translational invention. To even strengthen that, is there anywhere in the New Testament, because you would think that a New Testament writer would pick up on this, is there anywhere in the New Testament that quotes this in the Greek as saying, kiss the Son?
I don't remember that.
I don't think there is. I'd like to hear from the listeners on that, if they can find that in the New Testament, quoting it that way and as it appears in the Greek. That'd be interesting to find out. I don't think it's there.
By the way,
Yeah.
just for, it's interesting that this word in verse 12 appears, many times in Christian translations of the Bible, and it's always translated elsewhere as purity. And it's not as if it's always translated in Christian translations as son. This would be the only place that even Christians somehow come up with this, sort of out there translation. It's not consistent because every single other place in a Christian Bible, this Hebrew word appears. It's always translated correctly. So that would be a question that is worth thinking about also. I think the earliest Christian translations didn't render it as son. I think the earliest that I know about is the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate. And that was more in line with the traditional Jewish translations of embracing instruction.
Embrace discipline. That's right. So the only place in the New Testament, Luke 22, verse 48, Jesus said to him, Judas, you are betraying the Son of Man with a kiss. That doesn't really apply. All right,
that's the exact opposite.
That's the exact opposite. That's not kiss the Son lest he be angry. It's like, dude, can you not? Anyway, moving on before we get nailed down there. Oh, that's a terrible expression to use. Okay, moving on. Psalm 8, verse 2. We're in Psalm chapter 8.
We made it out of chapter 2.
We made it out of chapter 2. We're in 8. There's a couple of references in 8. It references verse 2 to verse 6 as being significant. And I might just read that. How about I read this one? Psalm chapter 8. It says, I'm going to start from the beginning. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants you have ordained strength because of your enemies, that you may silence the enemy and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? You have made him a little lower than the angels, and you have crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him to have dominion over the works of your hands, and you have put all things under his feet.
It's a very beautiful psalm.
Isn't it? Isn't it
very beautiful? Yeah. If we start off with number 66 here, the mouths of babes perfect his praise. Now, if I can just translate that, I think that what he's saying is that there'll be babies, I suppose, praising the Messiah. That's, I guess, what he's saying, that Psalms 8 tells us that the Messiah will be praised by babies. Matthew 21, I guess, has a story where the children in the temple are calling out Hosanna. I think they're calling out in praise of the Messiah. The
But
strange.
this is clearly not the Messiah. I mean, if you start from verse 1, I mean, I know the list doesn't start from verse 1. The list starts with verse 2, but verse 1 of Psalms 8, we have the Tetragrammaton identifying specifically who we're talking about, and it says, our Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. How do we jump from that verse into the second verse referencing the Messiah?
Well, that's the problem here, that the Christian compiler here, sort of makes the jump and equates Jesus with God. We have here a verse in Psalm 8:2 which speaks about praising God, and this entire psalm is about praising God who created the universe, created the stars and the moon, etc. So it's clearly a psalm speaking about God. And I think any reader would have difficulty understanding that it's speaking about the Creator. Now, how you get from that to making the assertion that it's speaking, you have to basically begin with the assumption that the Messiah is God Himself. But again, it's something which doesn't really come out of the text here in Psalms. I also thought it was interesting, by the way, that the Hebrew seems to imply that it's speaking about infants and nursing babies. That's the sense of the Hebrew, and the passage in Matthew 21 is pretty much not speaking about infants and nursing babies. It's speaking about children who were in the temple and actually speaking already. They're able to speak words. And so it wouldn't really line up, the story in Matthew with the passage in Psalms, because Matthew is clearly not speaking about nursing babies.
No, because Jesus here is saying, "Do you hear what these are saying?" This is, and He said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and nursing infants, you have perfected praise."
Right, but the narrative in Matthew, I believe, where you see Him being praised by children, are really older children. They're children who are probably, I imagine 4, 5, 6 years at the youngest, who were able to actually speak and praise. But Psalms 8 is really speaking about infants and nursing babies who would not be the kind of children that you see in Matthew 21. So Psalms 8:2, which is number 66 on our list, leaves me a little bit dry in terms of putting my faith in Jesus.
That one doesn't do it for you. So following on, the next one is still in Psalms 8. We are in Psalm 8, and it's referencing, this is number 67, verse 5 and verse 6, His humiliation and exaltation. And it's referencing a passage from Luke and 1 Corinthians. What I find really interesting, by the way, is that this list doesn't reference, I think it is Hebrews chapter, Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, quotes specifically from Psalm chapter 8, and it doesn't appear here in the list. I don't know why. I think, again, as you and I mentioned earlier, we could probably make a better list, I think, but in this case, we have Luke 24, the ascension and of Jesus, and then in Corinthians 15, it says, "For He has put all things under His feet," but when He says all things are put under Him, it is evident that He who put all things under Him is accepted.
Yeah, those are famous stories in the Christian scriptures. The problem is, what is Psalm chapter 8 speaking about? And
that's the question.
It's very clear when you just read Psalm 8 that it's not speaking about a particular individual, specifically not speaking about the Messiah, but it's speaking about mankind in general. It speaks about all human beings. And how low we are, how small we are compared to God. But God, though, the compiler of the list speaks about exaltation in the sense that, this humble Messiah is exalted, really to the level of God. Here, it's the not humiliation of people. It really speaks about the fact that human beings are small and humble compared to God, but that God ultimately gives human beings, not just the Messiah, gives human beings dominion over nature. That's the exaltation that this psalm is speaking about. It speaks about the fact that, as we see in Genesis 1:28, human beings were given a special role to play in the world of creation, and that really everything is under our dominion, and that's what you see in verses 6 to 8 in this psalm.
Now, this is. Let me just ask you about this, because there's a curious thing here, and particularly in verse 5. You're quite right when it's talking about mankind. It says in verse 4, it's not talking about an individual. What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you visit him? For you have made him a little lower than. Now, I've got in the English, I've got the angels, but that's not what it says, right? It says Elohim. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, again, you could translate it either way. I mean, the word Elohim is not a specific name for God himself. It is a term that is used for angels frequently. So you could very, very easily go with either translation and not be terribly wrong. But it seems from the context, at least, that it's speaking about God himself, because it was speaking about the creator of the stars and the heavens. God also created the angels. So it would be more difficult to plug the angels into this passage. But I think that the writer, often the translator, doesn't even want to talk about human beings, being a little bit lower than God. I mean, how do you even make that comparison? So I think that, so to take the edge off of it, it's okay, we're a little bit lower than the angels, which doesn't seem to be such an absurd comparison.
Fair enough.
But what is important to understand is that, someone reading Psalm 8, if they were reading this psalm 100 years before the Common Era, they wouldn't have even the slightest reason to assume that this was a prophecy about the coming of the Messiah. There's nothing to do with this psalm. There's nothing in the context of this psalm that points to the Messiah specifically, when it's very clear from just the reading of the words themselves that it's really a passage about humanity in general.
It's very clear.
Yeah, and again, the exaltation is not that humanity is going to become exalted to the point of being on the same level as God. The exaltation, the special raising up of these human beings, is that we were given a special place in the world of nature. We see this in the psalm itself, verses 6 to 8. That we've been granted dominion over the world of nature.
We're now upon number 68, and we're knocking on the door of Psalm 16. Now, this is one that I am used to hearing in the short list in my days in the church, and this one does take a little bit of explaining. I think because we've gone over an hour already, we might leave this to include in next week when we get into Psalm 22 as well. And so there's something that the listeners can look forward to. And but again, thank you, my friend, Rabbi Michael Skobac, for coming back onto Truth to You and discussing the 365 Messianic prophecies in the Tanakh, Messianic prophecies that Jesus apparently fulfilled in the New Testament. And we're making a dent. We're getting through it, my friend.
We're slowly getting there.
We're slowly getting there. It's going to be picking up next week, because both 16 and 22 are ones that I'm used to hearing on the short list. But just for the listeners, again, the website is JewsForJudaism.ca. JewsForJudaism.ca. Go there and enjoy the immense amount of resources that you will find there as well. And in the meantime, dear listeners, be blessed and be set apart by the truth of our Father's word. Shalom.
Excellent. I'm always very much uplifted by your ending, by the way.
Do you? Oh, really?
It's just because I really do. I feel it in my guts. I feel uplifted when I hear those words. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad.
You say it with a lot of resolve, and there's a lot of there's not just the words that are coming out. There's a lot of feeling behind those words, and I really always feel it with you.
The reason why I say it is because obedience is the source of blessing, and God blesses us in obedience. And the other reason why I like to say set apart is because a lot of people are confused by the definition of holiness, and it is the commandments that set us apart. And so it's a reminder. What we've just been discussing is truth, as opposed to what we've been used to hearing, particularly if you've been brought up in the church. So I appreciate that. Thanks for